I'm Steve Bennon, Chairman of the Jewish Studies Program of the Jackson School of International Studies, and joining me is my colleague Joel Migdal, Chairman of the International Studies Program of the Jackson School, and we're joined by our guest, Dr. David Weiss, a leading world authority on medical research, as well as an authority on Jewish history and Jewish philosophy and religion. Dr. Weiss, it's very good to have you in Seattle. And if I could ask you a question concerning the two worlds you seem to inhabit so well, that of science and that of religion, some people might find it odd that one could combine those two worlds in one person. How do you do that, and how do you reconcile what to many people seems to be two different worlds?
I suppose my own basic difficulty is to be able to understand the difficulty at reconciliation, or even the very term reconciliation. I suppose it depends very much on one's starting assumptions and definitions. If one bows down to the sacred cow of science, as once people did to the moon and to the stars, then there is obviously a clash with other religious value systems. If one's starting definition of nature is the classical Judaic one, that nature is the manifestation of the way the Creator sees fit to order the universe, then the two worlds automatically become one. In the words of early 20th century Rabbi straddles the centuries, Meir Simcha Hakon of Dvinsk, known as the Meshech Chochma or Sameach, a classic definition of nature is Bat Elokim or Yat Elokim, the daughter of God or the hand of God. If one accepts that perspective, then the question that you ask disappears really as a question. Question can be asked only from an entirely different set of assumptions.
Could you elaborate on that? What set of assumptions would bring one to ask the question as I phrased it, and how would you respond to it?
Yeah, there would be two assumptions really that could bring one to phrase the question. One of them, that's a simple one to dispose of, is the contention that scientific discoveries or truths as they are perceived by science clash with truths as they are stated by religious texts. That is a difficulty if one reads religious texts fundamentalistically. And there a human being can find himself in a quandary. In Judaism, we do not read our texts. We do not certainly need to read our texts fundamentalistically. We have essentially two bodies of Torah, a written Torah, which is a constitutional body of law and ideology, and an oral Torah, which is a long series of amendments and discussions to this constitution that remains flexible and dynamic and open to the present day. If one looks at Torah in two components, in both of its essential components, and for us Jews, adherence to the written Torah alone is quite meaningless. I couldn't begin to understand any sentence I would look at in terms of written Torah alone. If I look at the totality of Torah, I find any number of possible interpretations of certain descriptions of creation, creation of the universe, creation of man, and I find ultimately that I have an enormous latitude of freedom to explore and to discover. In short, let me summarize, God, the creator of the first molecule of DNA, who saw to its evolution in certain patterns, is no less a God of mystery, of wonder to me than God who decided to make all critters in the world within 6 days as we know days to be. Take your choice. Scientific evidence persuade me in one direction. Somebody else's evidence may persuade him in another. It's really totally immaterial. What is material is simply the assertion that there is a creator, that there is sense in a created world, that the universe was created for a purpose, that man has a certain function in it, and that man, regardless of what his immediate ancestry is, whether it's a piece of river alluvial mud or some other creature, that whatever my immediate ancestor is, I became man in some quantum jump in which a spark of a unique quality, what in Judaic terms would be called the image of God's being imprinted on me, occurs. So if I accept the notion of a creator, of purpose in creation, and of the uniqueness of man in a moral, spiritual sense, I can have the world as old as the evolutionary fossil evidence would suggest it to be, or as young as anybody else would argue to be, there's no conflict for me there. There would be conflict only if I read my text fundamentalistically. The more difficult assumption might be a bit more difficult to disprove at first sight, but it's just as much of a fallacy, is that science explains all. Well, if science explains all, then there would be no room for any other interpretation of reality. There one has to stop for a moment and ask oneself, what does science really do? And it really turns out that science explains very little, that science at best describes, that when science does attempt to explain, it does it only partially, and very often it has to postulate rather imaginary concepts to make sense of its own explanations. If a physicist speaks of matter and antimatter, he's really speaking in theologic terms, at least in part, because I can no more analyze antimatter in a test tube or in a spectrometer or by any other scientific machine than I can analyze the spirit that I believe is imbued in me. So science does not really explain, cannot explain, does not set out to explain very much, and to the extent that it does, it has to use a variety of abstract notions. What science does is to describe, essentially. It never asks questions, can never ask questions of ultimate origins, beginnings, or purposes. That's exactly what religion is involved in. So if one stops and thinks for a moment, we are dealing here, the language of science, the language of religion, we are dealing with two different ideational languages, each one addressing itself to a different reality, to a different dimension of reality. The two can be complementary. They cannot conceivably be opposed to each other because they deal with different reality, with different aspects of reality. Now, one can take it one step further and say, as my understanding of the material universe increases, I'm also increasingly impelled to postulate a creative force. It's the argument of the missing architect. If you tell me that the Empire State Building and the cement and the steel girders that go into it and the lipstick on the secretary's mouths and the tape recorders and the radios and the candy machines and all the millions of items in that thing all came about by a random collision over lots of millions of years of atoms or subatomic particles, you tell me I'm crazy. There's an architect, but I just didn't know him. It's a missing architect argument, okay? That is the kind of reasoning that has forced many scientists, including Einstein himself, probably the greatest of all, eventually to come to grips, to come to accept the notion of a creative intelligence. That doesn't necessarily mean a moral God, but it's certainly the first step towards a Judaic concept. You start with Ribbon Shalom, you may wind up with a Kodesh Baruch Hu. If you start with the creator of the universe, you might wind up with the Holy One, blessed be He. So to summarize that notion, we are dealing with two aspects of reality. When you deal with two very different aspects of reality and two different languages that must be used to describe them, to explain them, to relate to them, you cannot speak of conflict. You can speak of the possibilities of complementarity. The misunderstanding arises from the fallacy that science indeed explains the created world, its origins and its purposes, and therefore offers other interpretations than religion, when science does nothing of the sort.
May I pose the same question
Please.
on a slightly different level? The interpretation you gave of the Torah and of Judaism and its openness is one that's not accepted by all Jews, and certainly there are those who give a much more fundamental reading of the I wouldn't say closed nature of the oral law, but certainly its fixed nature. And I'm wondering if there are groups within Israel today or in the larger Jewish community in other countries who have a more literal reading of the scientific precepts in the Talmud, for example, who are trying to deal with this question of reconciliation.
Well, you know, people have hobbies and attitudes which, if you rub their nose hard against them, you find them having to beat a retreat. I yet have to meet a fundamentalist within Orthodox Judaism who can defend his position on solid halachic or Judaic ideologic terms. he may say that that's his preference. And indeed, there are such groups within Orthodoxy who would insist on reading the 6 days of creation as 6 days. But I've discussed this with many of them, from the top on down. Names don't have to be mentioned, but with leaders of the yeshivot in this country and in Israel, in which such perspectives are advocated. And in a direct clashing confrontation, what I've invariably found these people to say is, well, yes, I can't disagree with what you are saying, that there is such a Talmudic statement or such a Midrashic statement that there were 200 or 2,000 or 20,000 worlds before this one, and they were considered inadequate and they were destroyed, and that indeed the world of 6,000 years that we count according to the Jewish calendar more or less represents the world of civilization as we know it today. You cannot, after all, read out of the Talmud a statement like, man was created with webbing between his fingers and toes and with a tail. But later on, God, seeing that that wasn't particularly dignified, removed his tail and his web so as to distinguish him more easily from other creatures. The evolutionary implications of such a statement are enormous. Even more radically, a statement, if you want, an evolutionary hypothesis within Jewish thought, and there the authority is beyond the question of any ultra-Orthodox authority today. Look at Nachmanides as Ramban's reading of the creation of man. At first there was something that was inanimate. Then it began to roll around in the mud. Then it developed a proper movement. Then it developed an upright stance. Slowly it developed speech. Ultimately it became man. You have a very beautiful evolutionary description in which a time element isn't particularly discussed. Rabbi Kook, the great first chief rabbi of Israel, considered evolution one of the most sublime, religiously meaningful contributions of science to modern thought. Well, against these kinds of attitudes, if you go back to Talmudic and Midrashic times and Machshevet Yisrael, the ideology, the ideation of the people of Israel in the medieval period, that cannot be dismissed. All you can do then, if you want to be a fundamentalist, to say, yeah, but for all sorts of reasons, I'm afraid of these kind of speculations. I would prefer still to take a straight reading. That's a matter of preference. And on question
But
of...
it is the preference of
Yeah.
a strong group. I'm wondering why, if in fact halachically,
Why do they
can't
have the
they
preference?
cannot defend their position. Yes, why
Oh,
why
I have my
this,
own notion, but I'm sure that notion could be challenged. My notion is that post-Holocaust, having lost something like 40% of our people and a much higher percentage of those Jews who were Jewishly educated, learned in Eastern Europe, the whole Eastern European world, there is a kind of retrenchment. We're in for a dark period in religious thought. We've had golden periods, we've had darker periods. I think we're not in a golden period now, and I think it's very natural. Survivors of the Holocaust feel that they have to back up against the wall, and heaven forbid, lest any idea of modernity be permitted to intrude or to even be entertained. And there is a kind of reaction against all sorts of things that are not at all in defiance either of halacha or of at least mainstreams in Judaic thought. And yet, there is a fierce holding of the line against all the hostile outside world, which has been so destructive. After all, the Germans used scientific implements to destroy 6 million Jews. They did it very sophisticatedly, at least for the 1940s. So I can understand the reaction of these people. I don't take it terribly seriously because the reaction is not grounded in a solid philosophic or halachic basis Judaically. There is a book that I might suggest called The Challenge, edited by Carmel and Dom, or Dom and Carmel, I forgot the sequence of the authors, which is a series of essays all written by observant, quotes Orthodox Jewish scientists, dealing with questions of creation and evolution. And you'll find a spectrum of opinion. You'll find very few in that spectrum that really argue for a literal 6 days. And those who do will then take a sort of deus ex machina sub-argument and say, of course, a day then isn't what we call a day now. The attitude that 6 days then as 6 days now, and the fossils being created by God as a test of the absolute orthodoxy of his adherents is not a powerful, it is not an argument powerfully represented, strongly represented in numbers within Orthodox thinking.
Well, okay, if I may continue on this, at least a tangent of this theme, Israeli society today has a number of important cleavages in it. And one is the one we've been talking about. Those people who see Israel's ultimate survival based on its assimilation of modernity in one term or another, including technological sophistication and the like, and other groups who are afraid of what that may do to the Jewish people.
And the third category of groups, just if I may interrupt for a moment,
Go ahead.
that would have it both ways. I belong to the third category. You haven't mentioned that one, right? Of people who see modernity as the reality of our existence, who see Judaism as a system of values and behavior that is cogent at all times, who believe that the ideology of this Jewish state must be Judaic, but that its modus operandi is to be that of the 20th century, and then the 21st, and then the 22nd, and so on, and not of the 15th or 14th.
Do you see, my question among these three groups then is, do you see this as being a basic problem for maintaining a polity? Certainly in other parts of the world, this has turned into a very violent political issue. I'm wondering what you foresee its evolution in Israel.
Well, Sir Peter Medawar, once in my presence not so many years ago, he's one of the great scientific minds of our period, a Nobel laureate, but he's great despite the Nobel Prize and above the Nobel Prize, once quoted made the following statement to a group of younger scientists: young man, should you ever be asked what scientific discoveries will be like in the year 2000 or 2500 years, if you should ever be asked, resist the temptation, don't answer. I don't prophesize. I'm afraid prophecy has not been in recent periods of time particularly convincing in the world at large, or for that matter even among our own people. If you ask me what a quasi-intelligent forecast would be, or
I'll even change it. I won't let you slip out so easily.
Yeah.
How do you see these three groups and the divisions among them affecting life in Israel today?
The groups are not hardly coalesced groups at all. There's an enormous amount of overlap. There are people who might fall into one group by their garb, with the kapotte and the streimel and all the rest of it, whose thinking is as aggressively modern as that of somebody who eats pork chops if he can find a restaurant that'll serve them. There are people who do not wear a particular garb, who may not be particularly observant even, but whose philosophic attitudes are rather fossilized. So I just want to emphasize, you cannot here speak of identifiable groups. I rather speak here of streams of thinking with enormous overlaps and inconsistencies, difficult to pinpoint.
Absolutely, but let me just add to the question one sentence, that when I was in Israel a few months ago, I noted I had a conversation with people of your group, or your stream, let's call it, and they were exhibiting a fear for their children of the influence of those who have a fundamentalistic reading of these issues that I had not seen 7 or 8 years ago. I was really quite surprised at it.
I would make the following differentiation. Now I won't try to cop out of your question. There is an increasing adherence to mitzvot, to observance, even in its, I suppose I might say, minor bifurcations. There is an emphasis, and perhaps overemphasis, according to some people, of punctilious observance of the details and sub-details of mitzvot. And certain things are, in a sense, revitalized or translated into reality that Orthodox Jews on the whole in previous periods, at least in Western Europe and the United States, simply let slip into oblivion. As you know, halacha is a viable corpus, and in each period, in each epoch, there are some aspects of this text, of this body of texts and thought, which are emphasized, not they are de-emphasized. Give you a specific example. My father was an Orthodox rabbi, unquestionably Orthodox. Chief Rabbi of Lower Austria, became head of one of the largest yeshivot in New York, Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, when we came here. The first time somebody told him here, when we arrived in 1939, a rabbi from a Lithuanian yeshiva that he oughtn't to shake a woman's hand, he exploded in sheer anger at the rank superstition behind it. Now, he knew that there is to be found in some responsa or in several responsa, in the responsa literature, the notion that shaking a woman's hand, etc., etc., etc. In among the Western European Orthodox, strictly Orthodox rabbinate, this notion was totally non-viable. The idea of not listening to a female opera singer because kol isha erva, my father had a very simple answer. If she sings a pornographic song, I don't listen to it. If she sings Celeste Aida, I love it. Okay? It depends very much then on what you stress at a given moment. There is a tendency in Israel today among modern young Orthodox people to stress areas of observance that in other periods and in other times were permitted to slip quietly into quiescence. That is not necessarily a question of attitudes, it's a question of action and observance. With regard to attitudes, I find among many of the same people who put an increasing stress on observance, a kind of pietism in action, a full retention of a liberalism of perspective. Some of my most religious graduate students, people with beards, people who make up some of the settlements, the ideological religious settlements that are springing up on both sides of the Green Line, are being involved in their daily work in experiments and investigations that deal with evolution with absolutely no sense of a fear that they're trespassing. So, with regard to a body of attitudes that you might consider reactionary, there is such a body. I explain it as a post-Holocaust phenomenon in terms of its forcefulness. I don't think that that represents a serious threat to the future of Judaism as a viable body of belief and action. And it has its place at a given moment in time. Not only can it be understood historically, I believe, but it is, in a sense, a counterpoint to an opposite stream on the far other side of the spectrum, which in so many words whores after everything that was in fashion in American teenage culture 10 years earlier. That's about the time gap before it gets to Tel Aviv, right? So the youngsters in Israel on that opposite end of the spectrum tend to idolize rock stars who are now becoming middle-aged, American rock stars. So there is a polarity to some extent, as there always has been in Jewish society. And if there's one, there's going to be the other. One is to a large extent a counterpoint to the other. But there is a large central body, group of people who struggle with a continuous redefinition of what Judaic archetypes of values and observance mean in the context of being citizens of a modern world. Now, I would add to this one other notion. If there was a real Kulturkampf in Israel 35, 40, 50 years ago between the God of Judaism, and I'll put my prejudice on the table, and the idol of Marxism, the idol has been shattered. Marxism as an ideology is very little alive. It's a very moribund in Israel today. The revelations of 20th Party Congress, the attitude of the Soviet Union towards Jews in Israel, and so on and so forth. So what we are fighting, what the confrontation today is between Elokei Yisrael, between Judaism and its God, and the vacuum, a vacuum of values,
may I just
rather than a counter value.
May I ask one more question?
Please.
No, go ahead.
I wonder where you see the institutional fruition of this. We know that Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, which we're familiar with here, haven't really taken hold. Is it within the Orthodox framework or some new framework that this middle group that you talk about is really going to be able to develop the thoughts that you're referring to?
Forgive me if I say something snide. The term institutional fruition strikes me something like discussing a square circle. Things that are institutionalized, certainly among our people that are establishment, usually are not very fruitful. There are some exceptions to this, obviously. I look more to the people itself, to Amcha, to the ferment ideologically that is going on in Israel today in all sectors of society. I'm impressed by a kind of grassroots movement in the secular kibbutzim. It's expressed by journal Shtemot to an extent. Other such trends that look for Judaic values and roots without necessarily being prepared to make a leap into observance. I'm fascinated by the number of Orthodox individuals and small groups, groups of kids from a Hesder yeshiva, from all sorts of other backgrounds, who will simply decide, instead of spending the holidays with Papa and Mama, eating gefilte fish at home, or falafel, or whatever it is, to go into a development town and to make sameach, to make joyful for a holiday. There's an enormous amount of this going on, especially in the armed forces. This I see daily. I see it through my 3 sons who are in combat units. This dynamic interaction, it's quite leaderless, or it is, no, I'll take that back. It's not leaderless. It is not institutionalized. Whatever in Israel is institutionalized, I wholly and thoroughly distrust. I distrust institutions in all parts of the world, especially my own. So I don't look upon I don't know what institutionalization will develop into in Israel. I guess there may be a kind of peculiar selection. The people who are selected to run institutions are not the people whom I expect one of these days to see riding on the back of a donkey, waving a palm branch into Jerusalem and announcing the imminent coming of the Mashiach. I look upon some of the younger rabbis in Hesder Yeshivot who are tank commanders, who may not be of an age to be a tank commander, but who are in action with their people. I look upon the Chabad Hasidim, who may be the first into a new area that's being fought over, still under fire, and distribute mashke from the Rebbe. I look to the young soldiers themselves. I look to the youth movements of the Bnei Akiva for paving a new road towards a redefinition isn't the word I'm looking for, towards a construct in which Judaic values will become increasingly the animating ethical and ideologic drive of the society, even for people whose religious observance may not be punctilious. And here I'm encouraged. And I'm not troubled by the few thousand extremists who make themselves obnoxious. I mean, I'm outraged when I hear of another incident of stones being thrown at cars that drive on Shabbat, or at a swimming pool that's being opened. If they don't want to look at girls in bikinis, they can look the other way. That's not the way, that's not a Judaic reflexive response to challenge. That's counterproductive, but it's not serious.
I'm afraid that our time is up. It's been a pleasure having you, Dr. Weiss, and I know, speaking on behalf of myself and Joel, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for
very
being
much.
Here.